Good evening. Welcome once again to the third installment of the sessions of Territory, Urbanism and the Anthropocene, organized in this semester around the topic of ecology. In this lecture program, we are working collaboratively between the professorships of Marc Angélil and Architecture of Territory. And I would like to thank Sascha Deltz, Ferdinand Pappenheim, Hans Hortig, and Jörg Stovins behind camera for realizing this series. A few words to introduce the session. The questions that concerns us in this program, Sessions on Territory, I would say is really circles around the notion of urbanism, for me personally. It's about urbanism, even though urbanism is one of the words on the poster. I think we are bringing people and asking their positions on the future of urbanism. If this effort, urbanistic design, urban planning, urban design, landscape design, territorial design, and so on, should have a positive, progressive future in the society and be part of architects' education and architects' practice, what should be its main concerns and its main features? How should the future of urbanism be conceived? How should urbanism perform? And I would like to remind you that we have started this program more than a year ago with another series, a two-semester block of lectures that was called Urbanism Beyond Neoliberalism. And in that segment, our goal was to consider urbanism in the late 20th and early 21st century at the time of strengthening of neoliberal ideas or ideologies. So neoliberalism being the principal political economic model at the basis of social organization and the shaping of the built environment. And these are the times, so it's a long historical period in which we have seen the shrinking public sector and the shrinking state. And as a consequence, very sharp kind of transformation of the practice of architect-urbanist. In some cases, we have seen creation perhaps of new ideas, new opportunities. In some other cases, we have also seen certain manifestations of crisis. So these new responses to the new conditions were presented. We have curated 10 sessions with 10 speakers and 10 respondents and have discussed those new responses to the neoliberal conditions with guests including Arno Brandlhuber, Jenny Robinson, Stefano Boeri, Michael Deere, and Momoyo Kajima. And this semester we have relaunched our lectures on the future of urbanism under a different concern that we believe is the kind of second important stepping stone or second important force in shaping the practice of urbanism in the future. This is the notion of the Anthropocene, and we have put forward the topic of ecology as part of it. So I would say that if we look back at urbanistic practice as it was defined as part of the modern, even postmodern architecture in the 20th century, those are the practices that generally have not involved the elements of environmental critique. No? So only in the 1970s in architecture, art, and other disciplines we find currents or the kind of important discourses that are part of this environmental criticism. The example is the work of the Club of Rome and their influential report, Limits to growth in 1972, in which they have predicted Earth's capacity to support urbanization and the population and economic growth until, let's say, the mid of this century. Of course, we should discuss it. There are also many other features. So, in this, with this kind of perspective, we have again invited 10 speakers in this and the next semester that will be with us and that will discuss how the agency of design, so urban, territorial design, will be shaped in the future by the challenges posed by the Anthropocene and, as we could say, the necessity or the priority of ecological transition. So, in this sense, it is my great pleasure to welcome tonight Nikos Katsikis, who is with us here. Nikos is a brilliant young urbanist working at the intersection of urbanization theory, design, and geospatial analysis. He's a doctor of design from Harvard Graduate School of Design, currently a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Luxembourg at a program on architecture, European urbanization and globalization. And he is also a research tutor at the Royal College of Art in London. At the same time, he is our precious colleague and collaborator at the ETH Zurich Future Cities Laboratory in the program on territories of extended urbanization. He is also currently affiliated as postdoc with his, let's say, home base, Harvard GSD. He is on the editorial board of the new Geographies, where he brought out many interesting and important publications, such as the issue on grounding metabolism. And I would say that also something to look forward to, apart from his publications in Harvard Design Magazine, in New Geographies, in MONU, in Implosions, Explosions, we can also announce the new forthcoming book with Neil Brenner, Is the World Urban? Towards a Critique of Geospatial Ideology. And after Nikos' talk, we will have a pleasure to discuss with Christian Schmid, Chair of Urban Sociology, and Ilmar Hurkxkens, who is a doctoral student and a senior researcher at the Institute of Landscape Architecture, and also somebody who has a very interesting, very experimental work that also involves GIS, automation tools, and so on. So more about them later, and first help me to welcome Nikos Katsikis.
Yeah, I don't think I need that, do I?
You don't need it, that's true.
Does this work? Yeah, you can hear me. Perfect. Okay, thank you very much, Milica. Yeah. I appreciate it very much, the invitation. It's great to be here after long periods of collaboration, intellectual affiliation. So what I will be presenting today is building upon the work that I developed at the GSD while doing my dissertation there, but also it will reflect recent ongoing work. Part of it is part, actually, of the Territorials of Extended Urbanization Research Project, so I'm glad that also Christian is here, along with Ilmar, to discuss several issues out of it. If you don't mind, I like moving around, so if I'm not blocking anyone, I will just keep having a more loose presentation style. So, it's actually interesting because when you see the Anthropocene work in a design environment, you always think that it has something to do with a need for designers to claim agency. And it's actually a coincidence that I was on Friday at the AA at a conference that was called Urban Agency or Design Agency within the Anthropocene. And I realized that the Anthropocene has actually something in it that designers find extremely fascinating. It suggests that humanity is basically the #1 driver in shaping the world. And if humanity is the #1 driver in shaping the world, so the world can be shaped, actually. It can be designed somehow. There is something like that in the background. People don't necessarily want to agree with it, but they feel the urge to actually claim some agency in this project, right? And it can be problematic in several ways. And some of the ways why it can be problematic, I will try to unpack today. So my presentation is not exactly about the Anthropocene, is related to the fabric that we conceive as the anthropogenic fabric, and it tries to unpack it a bit, but it tries to do it through a particular lens that brings together a theory of planetary urbanization that Christian with Neil have been developing, and also theories about the relationship between social and ecological value. That's why I have the word surplus there, which is a word that directly refers to the notion of value. And the notion of value, I think, it's extremely problematic the way it is actually understood, especially in relation to urbanization. So value and urbanization are in a way grasped a bit through these quotes from the recent UN Habitat in 2016. So you see there that there is this understanding that you have the cities, all the population is basically concentrated there. They don't actually cover that much land, but they produce all the value in society, right? So cities are actually producing more than 70% of the world's GDP. At the same time, however, they have a negative ecological impact. So they produce economic value, but they suck in ecological value, and they give back waste. And this is kind of a problematic dichotomy right there. Maybe some of you have seen it in the form of this map, which is the famous spiky world map of Richard Florida redrawn here. This is a map that extrudes the points that have the highest GDP concentration, if we actually accept that GDP is a good way of grasping social value, right? And you can see all the big cities in all the rich countries actually popping up. So it's not directly related with population concentration, as you can see, because in countries like India, for example, where you have huge population densities, you have no spikes, but in North America or Japan or in Europe, you have all these spikes that suggest that cities are the driving forces of the economy, right? So everyone is happy with the positive externalities of agglomeration, with agglomeration economies, with creativity, with all the good things like innovation, for example, that come out of them. But at the same time, they are a bit puzzled because cities are also consuming a lot of ecological value, and they are contributing a lot of waste. So this is a map that comes together with that, or it's like the opposite of that. And in this case, it's not production, it's consumption of biomass. It's like a way to grasp a bit ecological value and the way it circulates. And as you can see, again, cities pop up, but this time mostly because indeed it is where people live, and according to the different lifestyles and consumption patterns, they have this negative impact on the environment. Now, obviously, when you see this map and this map, you see that everything else in the world is basically not contributing anything, like in social production, right? But if you question where the ecological value that is consumed in cities is produced, you actually start looking the spikes being around cities, extending beyond cities, in the productive landscape that support them. So this is exactly the dichotomy that I want to unpack a bit today. This relationship between this understanding of value and the role of agglomeration in producing it, right? Let's say the platform for producing economic value and growth is the city, is the concentration. And also the activation of all these terrains that surround cities that are invisible in the typical understandings of urbanization. So the problem with all that, as Christian and Neil have been arguing constantly over the past years, is that the understanding of urbanization is very much related to a process of population concentration. So everyone kind of agrees that this is what urbanization is about, is people moving to cities and cities growing, right? So in a way, it's like this diagram that you have seen. You know, there is the total population of the world, and then there is a population moving to cities. Now, in fact, what I find more interesting, instead of looking at this diagram, it's actually looking at this diagram. This diagram shows something like the densification rate. So it shows how much percentage of the world population is living at what density. So the different colors correspond to densities. The darker the color, the larger the density. And then on the horizontal axis, you have the different dates from 1800, right? And on the vertical axis, you have the percentages. And what you should observe from this map is that you have a rate of densification that is actually higher than the rate of population growth. So someone could say, okay, population is growing, so it's normal that cities are growing because the population is growing as well. But population is concentrating to cities, it's concentrating to dense settlements faster than it is actually growing. So indeed, the densification of population is happening. The problem is that it's not just about people moving to cities. See, here you can see the population distribution from 1975, for example, 2015, and you can indeed see the darker areas becoming darker, but also you can see other areas in the map emptying out. So you have like a crystallizing pattern of areas that are densifying and areas that are somehow being emptied out. And the biggest problem of all is that for some reason, people feel the urgency out of this overall distribution of population to delineate certain areas in the world that are the denser ones and just try to study these as specific phenomena of urbanization. So the point here is that indeed, if you take all these, they don't really cover that much space. In fact, if you take all settlement areas, I'm not just talking about cities or large agglomeration. I'm talking about everything, like towns, villages, every small concentration of people, buildings, infrastructure. They don't really occupy that much space. They occupy something like 2 or 3 million square kilometers, something like that. And the whole area that humanity is using, so if you want to discuss Anthropocene, the anthropogenic crust, for example, that is using the planet, is covering something like 100 million square kilometers, which is around 70% of the overall surface of the Earth, right? So you have this distinction between this 3% or something like that, that is actually settlement space, and everything else, let's say, all these utilized areas of the planet. So the proposal here is that, indeed, concentration is a very important factor. People concentrate for a reason. Economic activities concentrate for a reason. This is an important process that characterizes contemporary urbanization. But the essence of urbanization, I think, it's not the concentration per se, it's not this moment of concentration, it's all the forms of interdependencies that are created because of that. You can understand that as the social and spatial division of labor, you can understand it as a metabolic processes or anything like that, but the fact is that the more the people concentrate, the more interdependent they become with each other, with other people in agglomerations, with other people in other agglomerations, with other people in all these other areas of the world. So it's interdependency because of concentration, and it's not concentration per se, that maybe is a way into understanding the organization of all these other 70%, all this fabric of the Anthropocene. Obviously, this concept builds directly upon the whole planetary urbanization framing, and especially it will try to unpack extended urbanization. I assume that everyone is familiar with the agenda, so I won't take any time to unpack it. But just to summarize it a bit, so besides the process of concentrated urbanization, as I mentioned, there are all these forms of interdependencies that could be understood as process of extended urbanization. And obviously, this relationship between the two, which is a dialectical relationship, is not static. It's continuously reconstituted throughout time as through forms of creative distraction, for example. Now, if we understand urbanization as geographical organization, then we can reframe a bit our understanding of what the urban fabric is. And I like to challenge a bit this concept and go from the urban fabric that everyone is used to associate with the densely built up, densely populated fabric of cities. And obviously, this is Manhattan. You can always recognize it through its shape and the Central Park. That obviously is taking different forms. So we all agree that when we talk about the urban fabric, this is what we have in mind, right? It can take different forms, it can spread out, it can become, the megalopolitan corridor in the Northeast United States, but that's it. The point is that the fabric of urbanization should not only be understood as this fabric, the fabric of cities, it should be understood as something that can include all these other landscapes that correspond to this dark mass that I presented earlier. So not limited to the zones of concentrated urbanization and the settlement areas, but also including all the rest. So the question is, what is all the rest? If you actually break down the numbers very roughly, and you try to figure out what it is, you see that the built-up space, not just cities, everything, infrastructure, for example, highways, it's not so significant. It's around 1 million square kilometers. Most of it is areas of primary production, like cropland, like forestry zone, like grazing zones, right? So soft scapes, soft areas that we normally understand as nature, right? And if you look at them at the map, you just plot the distribution of these different things. You see here the distribution of the density of constructed surfaces, how cropland is organized around the planet, how grazing and forestry zones, and also infrastructural networks, and marine networks, air routes, things like that. So you have now start having an idea about the constitution, the configuration of this black mass, and it's not a black mass anymore. Maybe if you overlay these things, it's a gradient composite where all these different land uses and all these different fabrics are interwoven in very uneven ways. So instead of actually trying to see cities and non-cities, you start having understanding at the unevenness of this fabric of urbanization, right? In the blue color here, you can still see population concentrations. In the red one, you can see intensities of infrastructure, the densities of transportation networks, of dams, and things like that, right? Within and beyond cities. And with the green color, you can see the intensities of different forms of primary production. And you can already start understanding different patterns, for example. Like, for example, in the US, in the middle of the United States, you have a lot of infrastructure without really having a lot of people, right? In the Amazon, you have primary production without really too much infrastructure. Or in India, for example, you have both a lot of productivity, you have both a lot of population without necessarily a lot of infrastructure. So you start understanding, just by sketching these things, the differentiation of the composition of the fabric of urbanization. Obviously, the unevenness is not because of that. It's about the conditions, the social and economic conditions of the production of space. But still, you get a glimpse of the differentiation of this black mass around the planet. Now, you can still make some other observations that, to me, are quite amusing. First of all, if you compare, I mean, we are architects, we like to build stuff, we like to, construct, and in some countries even, architecture schools are within schools of the built environment, right? But if you actually look where the built environment is, most of the built environment, it's not in cities. Most of the built environment, like the absolute numbers, it's in infrastructure outside cities, right? So this graph shows, in the blue line, obviously the density of built constructed surfaces in relation to population density. And with the red color, you can see the percentage of it. And with the black color, you can see the percentage of total population living in certain densities. So you can see from the orange line that most of the infrastructure is concentrated in areas with very low density of population. Obviously, the densest one is concentrated with areas of high population density, but most of it, in absolute numbers, is not there. So if you really want to shape, to build, even if we agree that we only need to build, to construct artificial surfaces and not everything else, which is also questionable, even the constructed surfaces are not necessarily only in cities. The second point is that if you observe over time what urbanization is producing as a form of fabric, everyone would say something like, oh, urbanization is basically the city growing and consuming whatever land is around it. It's consuming the forest, it's consuming agricultural land, it's growing, let's say, it's adding built stuff around it. But if you look at the big picture, urbanization is not only adding constructed surfaces, it's also adding agricultural areas, grazing areas, it's also adding all these other areas of primary production. Maybe they are not adjacent to cities, obviously, they are somewhere else, but they are also growing. So when a city is growing in one place, agricultural land maybe is growing in another place, right? Now, how we go around that? We have the concentrated extended urbanization processes framework in mind, and the question is how we can relate them to particular landscapes, to particular fabrics, to particular moments of the urbanization fabric. And my proposal is we can have a very simple, let's say, gradient in mind, also following this map right here that shows, the composite configuration based on the combination of different things, right? So if you just start with that, you can say that on the one hand, I have, the traditional, the typical urban fabric, the fabric of the cities, right? The dense settlement with the business district, with the suburbs, with the infrastructure, with all the pieces of equipment that a city has, right? And on the other hand, across a full spectrum, a full gradient of different combinations of things, you can have an area like that, which is like an industrialized, specialized, monofunctional area of agricultural production, right? So here you have, population density, investment density, equipment, buildings. Here you basically have no population, you have a lot of infrastructure, you have a lot of productivity. Or it can be like a mine, something like that. Again, mostly machinery, production, no people. Or it could even be a port, like an automated port. Again, automated production, automated circulation, minimal presence of population. So if we have this in mind, these two, let's say, extreme cases, we can start unpacking maybe what is in between. And obviously, there are several configurations that are going to challenge this notion, but it's always easier to start with what is the simplest thing to identify. So what I'm going to talk about today is actually certain cases, particular cases of operational landscapes, among which I think the most interesting to identify, and the most easy actually to identify, and the most interesting to unpack are certain operational landscapes that play, we can say it, like the role of the global cities play in globalization. We also have some landscapes, some operational landscapes that are extremely important in the globalization of primary production. So let's say these are not obviously, these do not correspond to all of them, but they are some very particular examples, and they are very important ones for some reasons. So this is the whole, global city or cities in globalization debate summarized here in the famous diagram by John Friedman. And the whole idea is that under the flexible organization of production, you have, and the new division of labor, you have certain cities that acquire particular important roles in coordinating the world economy. And also, these cities tend to have more relations and more connections to each other and interact in a network than they actually have with the rest of the territories and the rest of the cities that are adjacent to them. And obviously, this has to do with the flexible organization of production and the reorganization of trade, which helped distribute production all over the world and create the need to coordinate this distributed production. And you can see that by looking at the growth in the trade of manufactures here, which is basically growth in the trade of intermediate products. So parts that you actually have manufactured all over the world, and then you need to bring them back in order to assemble them, right? Now, this diagram is interesting for two reasons. One reason is that the extreme growth in the trade of manufacturers actually dwarfs the growth in the other sectors, in the trade of the other sectors, in agricultural products and in fuel and mining exports, so in the growth of trade in primary production commodities, which actually, if you look at it, it has more than tripled. The second is that a diagram like that, which is a typical diagram to understand global trade, is only measuring the value of things. So obviously, if you measure the value of things, the more valuable things appear also to have the more volume, right? So it's not trade in terms of things, it's trade in terms of money, right? The material trade is a bit obscured here. So we don't really know how much stuff is being circulated, we know their value, right? So if you actually look at the extraction of stuff, the extraction of material that has been taking place since the 1900s, you also see around the 50s that there is a huge spike in growth in the extraction of both construction materials, ores and minerals, fossil fuels, and biomass, which includes agricultural products and forestry products, right? And my point here is that besides this globalization, besides this growth in the trade of manufacturers and the coordination of global production, there has been an invisible globalization of the primary sectors of the economy. And this globalization is actually the one that these operational landscapes are trying to grasp, right? And actually, this globalization of the primary production of the economy is also what's shaping the anthropogenic landscapes around the world. Because as we saw, most of the landscapes are landscapes of primary production, right? And how they are actually constituted around the world is equally specialized and equally concentrated as the specialization of different cities contributing in different sectors of the economy, right? So similar to the specialization of cities, there is also specialization of operational landscapes. And this is just a series of maps that try to show these islands of primary production. So if you start looking at different things, you realize that almost all production in the world, for example, of palm oil, is happening in one place. Or almost all cotton production is happening to 5-10 regions in the world, right? Even more in things that are more rooted in geological strata, like mineral extraction. Obviously, we all know how much this geographic specificity of fossil fuel resources has impacted the global geopolitical agendas. So the bottom line here is that these operational landscapes are globalized, specialized, and they cannot be conceived to interact with cities in the typical idea that we had or we used to have about the city and the hinterland. So let's say an easy way to understand the relationship of a settlement with all these other territories is to think of it as a city and a region. For example, let's say, where does Zürich get its water? It's maybe from the surrounding region. In some cases, and for some things, this is still the case. So, for example, for water, the metabolism of water is always very regional. But in most cases, all these networks are extremely globalized and exploded. So you cannot really say that you can identify the hinterland of any city. On the contrary, perhaps all these landscapes are feeding all the cities in the world, right? So in the same way that you had this idea, the city, and it's actually sourcing material from all over the place, in the same way, you have these hinterlands that are actually feeding, they are actually supporting all the cities in the world. So it's a bit of a reversal of this argument, right? And to complicate things even more, it is not even that from these areas, commodities end up directly to a city. Sometimes they end up to another operational landscape. A good example is this map that shows the part of agricultural production that is actually used to feed cattle and animals. So these are areas that produce food, but the food doesn't end up to a city. It ends up to another operational landscape that is actually raising cows, right? This is the landscapes, on the contrary, that are actually used to produce food. But again, even here, you have to imagine all the intermediate steps in processing, in transportation, between the production of any primary commodity and the final consumption in some city in the world. So this landscape, actually, which is producing corn, and we will discuss about it later, is feeding this landscape, which is 1,000 miles west of it. It's not feeding any city. It's not producing any food for anyone. Even this landscape is not being linked to a particular city. It's being linked to a processing facility, which is in another operational landscape, okay? So my point here is that we cannot anymore understand this relationship between the agglomeration landscapes and these other hinterland conditions in a linear way. On the contrary, we need perhaps to have a more hybrid understanding of the relationship between social systems, natural systems, and the way they are actually playing out on this urbanization fabric. So the urbanization fabric is not a set of linear relationships. It's actually like a matrix of different operations, and through the different commodity chains and logistic networks, these operations are activating different types of infrastructures, of structures. They are creating different concentrations or not in different parts of the world. And this is an alternative way of understanding the organization of the fabric of urbanization around the world. Now, an additional layer to that, and because it's quite striking to me that all these landscapes that I have been discussing about are landscapes of primary production, primary productivity, meaning value extracted out of nature, out of the land. It's not value added through processing or through intellectual work or through human labor so much. It is value that nature contributes. And eventually, the point here is to challenge a bit the two maps that I presented at the beginning, that you have, the GDP value, economic value, that is basically in cities, and then you have nature actually contributing some ecological value, but no one really knows how. I'm taking that theoretical framework from the work of world system ecologist Jason Moore in order to bridge a bit, hybridize this understanding of value. So, and what I will try to do is actually take this and try to link it a bit to the operational landscapes and to the organization of the fabric of urbanization. So for Jason Moore, our value obviously comes through work, but work not as only paid work through social labor, so things that you do and you're getting paid for, but also work that is not accounted for in the system. And this is the interesting part, can come both from human agents, but also from extra-human agents. From human agents, it's quite easy to imagine. For example, let's say costs of social reproduction that are not accounted for. You are raising your kids instead of having your babysitter, for example, and paying her, right? But for extra-human nature, it is nature contributing work to the system without it being accounted for. So when you actually are farming the land, right, you are yourself putting in some work, some labor, but nature is also putting some work for growing the plant, right? Or even one step before, nature has already put some work to add fertility to the soil through the decomposition, for example, of other plants and chemical processes. So this is work that you can take for free without paying for it. And for Jason Moore, the combination of this unpaid work that can come both from human agents and from extra-human agents, it's called the ecological surplus. And for Moore, the whole idea is to reread the different phases of capitalist development through the search for appropriation of ecological surplus. Now, a very simple way to try to relate that to a geographical aspect, to the actual physical configuration of things, like very simply, immediately, you can actually say, oh, okay, paid work, you mostly have it, I mean, the exploitation of paid and unpaid human work, you can have it where the most of the people are, so in agglomeration landscapes, in agglomeration zones. But the opportunity to appropriate unpaid natural work, you mostly have it where nature is being put to work for you, right? So in these landscapes of primary production. Now, the interesting thing is that the more you actually take appropriate value out of nature or out of human societies, the limits for doing that start to shrink. I mean, an easy example always is to think of a field that you farm. You start farming the field, right? And it's super fertile because no one has farmed it before. But as you start farming it, you exhaust the fertility of the soil. So you have to compensate something that was free, like the fertility of the soil, with fertilizers, right? So you have to pay for something now that you didn't. Which means that the ecological surplus that used to be higher, now it's actually thinning out, right? So there is a tendency of the ecological surplus to fall, which actually reduces the capacity of a capitalist development to appropriate a surplus value. An easy way to conceive that, if we go back to the fabric, is to try to see the relation between the development, the growth of population, and the expansion over the land. So an easy way to say, an easy thing to say is, oh, obviously, when I want to have more surplus, the possibility for more surplus, I need to find, for example, new land, new resources, right, that have not been used before. So they have the capacity to contribute free value to the system. And the easiest way to do that is to expand your footprint. So this is a map that actually shows the ratio, a diagram that shows the ratio of population growth, the rate of population growth over the rate of the expansion of land overall. So all types of used land, cities, agricultural land, forestry, grazing areas, things like everything together, right? How fast we are expanding. Now, if you start from 1800, you see that population is growing, population is the black line, and land is expanding faster than the population is growing. So the population is growing, land is expanding, but the expansion of the land is happening in a faster rate, which means that we are adding more land per capita. For every person, more land is being added, okay? After a point, after the 1950s or 1940s or something like that, the population keeps growing exponentially, but land, although it's still expanding, it's not expanding as fast, which means that if you actually do the division of how many people you have to support per square kilometer of land, you have a ratio that at the beginning it falls, so you actually have to support less people for the same land, and then it starts growing, which is actually a very simple way to understand the process of intensification of the use of the existing land. So for the same land, and agriculture is again a good example, you have to support more people. How you do that? Because the land has a limited capacity to contribute ecological surplus, you have to add it in the form of mechanization, in the form of energy inputs, in the form of fertilizers. Okay? And if you just look that at a map, and this map shows the relationship of the population growth with the expansion over the land, with the red being the land area used, you see that at the beginning, still in the colonial era, you have more and more land being added, especially in North America, for example, right? But after a while, you have like a fixed amount of land that just keeps becoming deeper and deeper red. So the more red, the more intensively used, okay? And yet another way to map this shift from the frontier, which contributes a lot of surplus, to the exhaustion of the frontier, is just to take one operation, agriculture, and see over this map, which maps the fertility of the land. So this is like a theoretical model that tries to grasp which are the optimal areas to cultivate, right? And this is again in the 18th century. And you can see on the red the expansion of agriculture. And you can see how gradually all the optimal areas for cultivation are being consumed. And the only areas that we have left are basically the Amazon and the rainforests in Central Africa. Okay, so go cultivate there. Now, I will wrap it up by showing two examples. So I will dig a bit more into this example of agriculture and the exhaustion of the agricultural ecological surplus. And also I will do it for mining later. I just have to make sure that I'm not super late. Oh, I am a bit. So let's go fast then. So again, corn, we saw it already. One of the biggest corn-producing areas is the American Midwest, so here in the US, and this is just showing the cultivation of corn. And there are some striking numbers there. The one is that basically US agriculture is just an industrialized, automated machine, right? So you only have 3 million farmers for almost 4 million square kilometers. This is one guy for every 2 square kilometers for a huge area. So one guy is managing a huge area of land. And the other is that 30% of the corn exports are actually produced in only one region. But the most striking thing is that you keep having an increase in the productivity with less and less people working on the land, which just means more and more capital inputs in machinery, in energy, and fertilizers. So in overall, I mean, you can also extrapolate that to the whole world and say that less and less farmers are supporting the global population, but just in the case of the US, the graph is quite dramatic. So what is a landscape like that made of? If you look at the history of it, it's actually a very interesting example of this exploitation of ecological surplus. So this landscape is extremely fertile, or used to be extremely fertile at the beginning, because it's right at the edge of the end here of the glacial deposit. So the white line shows the limit, the southern limit of the glacial age 20,000 years ago, right? And obviously everyone knows that glaciers bring all the sedimentation with them and they make the land very fertile. So if you end up there, first you can take advantage of all the fertility. In addition to that, this landscape here, again we are somewhere here, it's right on the border, right, of the arid versus sub-humid climate zone. So everything that is on the left receives less than, I think, like 600 millimeters of rain annually, so it's basically dry. And everything that is to the right, it's quite well irrigated naturally. Okay, so it's like, again, if we go to the fertility map, it's like the perfect region to cultivate. And obviously, when the expansion, the colonization of the US started, and this is the phases of colonial agriculture, actually, so this map doesn't actually show any of the pre-existing civilizations. It just shows the expansion. You actually start seeing that at some point, they reach this very fertile area, and then they start taking advantage of this initial ecological surplus. And if you zoom in this region, here, which is actually the size of, it's basically 2 times the size of Switzerland, it's only cultivating almost one thing, and 90% of it is farms. So imagine that you have an area 2 times the size of Switzerland, and 90% of it, it's doing one thing, it's only one land use, and the black color here, it shows the cultivation of corn in this region. But still, this homogeneity, this standardization of the landscape is constructed in different phases. And the most interesting part of it is how this initial geographical condition has been adapted to a more regular environment. So I have this map here, and here you can see actually the glacial move, let's say, so how the glacier was pushing, okay, all the sediments. And here you can see all the alluvial deposits moving south and making the rest of the area fertile. Again, this was the end of the glacier. The problem is that if you want to really take advantage of the fertile soil you have here, this is also submerged, which also means that it's flooding. So you need to start putting a lot of infrastructure there. So this is all the drainage infrastructure that is being put under this landscape that you just saw, and you cannot really see it. This is all the wells that you have to pump water, and these are all the dams that you have in the south part that is actually moving all the alluvial deposits to keep these fertile soils. And if you combine this with all the artificial tiling that is put in the ground, you realize that this is not a natural environment at all. This is a completely artificial, constructed environment. So this just shows the density of tiling. Tiling is just it is just a way to put some pipes underground, so you make sure that you keep the water from washing out the soil. And as you can see, almost an area of almost two times the size of Switzerland is equipped to keep the soil fertility there and take advantage of it. And how the production looks in a landscape like that, again, going back to the idea of the indirectly linked operational landscape, you can see that almost none of it is used for food. 60% is used for livestock, and 30% is used for energy. So it's actually very amusing, because when you do an exercise like that, and you position, for example, so in the background you can see, all the corn farms, the farms cultivating corn, and these rectangles are actually structures like that, where you collect corn and you move it from the farms. And if you see how they are organized along the rail corridors. So the whole thing is like a big conveyor belt that takes the grain out of the earth, it puts it in these little boxes, and then the train comes and it moves it to Chicago. Or, if you don't want to move it to Chicago, you actually feed it to pigs and cattle, and these are all the feedlots that are in the area. But most importantly, you transport it to feed the cattle that is in the surrounding cattle raising zones in the US, okay? So in a way, this region here is feeding this region here. And the second thing they're doing is they're producing bioethanol through all these versions of green capitalism, right? So 30% of it goes to producing bioethanol in these plants that you have here, that they are also on the railway corridor. So the train comes and picks up the bioethanol. And in addition to that, as if this was not enough in the operational capacity of this landscape, you have windmills like that, right? Wind farms, which are located here, and you have a supergrid that harnesses the wind power out of them. And this is actually a nice picture, because you can see all the elements together. So you can see the farm here, which still looks like an old school farm. You can see the grain elevator here, right? And you can see the wind farms, and you can even see the train carrying the biofuel, okay? The second example I want to show is in the north of Chile, in the Atacama Desert, and it's an example to show you how often this idea of the exploitation and the appropriation of the ecological surplus is not so linear, and it depends upon what you are actually trying to appropriate. So in this case, we all know, the obsession with green electric cars and things like that, right? But batteries need to come from somewhere. I mean, the lithium, actually, in the batteries need to come from somewhere. And this is just a graph showing the amount of lithium that you need for every battery in a Prius. And through this investigation that we did with students at the RCA, the Royal College, we actually tried to see what is the situation and the pressures in one of the major lithium mining areas in the world. So lithium mining is quite interesting in terms of the ecological surplus in the work of nature, let's say, because it's not labor intensive at all, because it doesn't require any mining, basically. It's a bit like, these are like salines, for example. You just have the brine there, and lithium is within the brine, and you wait for the water to evaporate, and you take the lithium out of the mud. Okay, so basically, the only thing you have to do is to do the land formation of these boules here, and then wait until lithium brine comes out, and you can actually take it. The interesting part is that this configuration here is actually this Salar de Atacama, where you have the lithium mines. Again, Switzerland for scale, it's basically the size of Switzerland, the whole region. And the whole region is again in a very particular location because you have the Andes here, and all these little blue points are basically volcanic little mountains. And you can see that there is something like a temperature ridge here that allows a lot of water to be coming down from the Andes here. And water is very important for mining because you need it both for, as you saw, for the lithium, but also you need it for copper mining, which was what traditionally configured this landscape. So as you see, you have just a few mining towns in this region, a lot of infrastructure, and obviously this infrastructure is associated not with the cities, but with the mines. So all the white ones are the copper mines, and the orange ones are actually the lithium mines. And the reason why this is interesting is that from one perspective, this region is a region that has been mined for several decades. And for example, for copper, the capacity of the ecological surplus is exhausted, so they don't have a lot of water. They have basically exhausted their capacity to mine very cheaply. But for a new thing, like lithium, for example, there is still a lot of ecological value to be appropriated that you can actually extract. And if you look, if you look on the ground, you can actually still see, that is basically a few people just moving soil around, and then nature just doing the work here until you extract the lithium. And this is just a sequence showing the expansion of the lithium ponds here from late 90s to 2000. I just showing a few graphs that we did that try to unpack a bit the system of lithium and also how it's in competition with lithium extraction. But I think I should probably wrap it up here because it's already 1 hour or more. And the last diagram I wanted to have on the wall is, again, reconsider a bit this idea, of urbanization as population growth in relation to urbanization as an intensification of these interdependencies and an intensification of land use that is not just in cities, but also in all these operational landscapes. Thank you very much.
Well, it's a fantastic, it's really fantastic. It's a kind of tour de force, and I think that Neil Brenner and Christian, who are a bit of mentors in your intellectual project with their theories on planetary urbanization and extended urbanization, I think that they probably have dreamed of such, let's say, a next generation of scholars that is coming, such as Nikos, who really unpack this case, through case studies, through important demonstration of the implications of those theories. And let's say, just to start as a kind of a warm-up, I have a lot of questions, and I will start with one question, then I would invite Christian and Ilmar to respond, and after that we will see how the discussion goes. So my question would go to the notion of value that you have shown in such an interesting way, let's say rewritten or sort of corrected through the work of Jason Moore and others who point to the existence of the paid work and the unpaid work, and this extraction of ecological value being that motor, let's say, which fuels the creation of agglomerations, but essentially being unaccounted for, and then pointing to the fact that we are dealing with this problem of exhaustion of that value, right, which is one of the crucial themes in this problematic of Anthropocene. So We have had in our first session guests also from the Royal College of Art, cooking sections, and that there was a bit of a discussion about monetization of that ecological value, right? So there are efforts to calculate. So through the effort of monetizing, of calculating, expressing through the kind of financial value that unpaid labor, we would, let's say, be able to counter that exhaustion. We would be able to create the kind of transfer of value in different ways from, you know, let's say, from certain companies to the land, et cetera, et cetera. So there is also a discussion about the something called the inherent value, right? So let's say the transfer of our understanding of value from inherent values to the monetary values. I would like to ask you what, you know, I think it's a very interesting point in the whole project intellectually. What is your position? Are you critical of those efforts? Do you see some possible openings there?
I think I can keep talking with that. No, I think that's indeed an interesting process. Just to maybe contextualize a bit things. So you can take the example that I presented from Jason Moore, for example, as one critical interpretation coming from, you know, a Marxist background, but there is nevertheless a quite growing, I would say, debate on something called ecological economics, which is not necessarily as critical as Jason Moore's interpretation. So it's not so much invested in how this misappropriation, for example, of the work of nature or the work of unpaid work of humans is leading to different patterns of uneven development, is more like instrumental, or wants to be more instrumental, or how we can basically put a price on the negative externalities of capitalist development. So we associate them with the costs, right? And I think the best, I would say, not example, but if you just want to be convinced about how messy this approach has been, you can just look at the carbon trading system and its effects on the landscape. So carbon trading is basically, first of all, it's just isolating carbon as the only negative externality that we should worry about. Like there is nothing else happening in the world, right? There is no other negative externality. It's just carbon, because carbon is important for raising temperatures and blah, 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 right? So let's say we price it somehow. Then we create a market for carbon, which obviously, if it's a market, it's becoming part of all the irrationalities of the financialized nature of markets that we have today. So investing in carbon, for example, it's the same as investing in corn and speculating in corn. It has nothing to do with the use value of these things. It's just a matter of exchange. So you end up having companies that want to pollute, that keep polluting, and then they buy off land, for example, in a random area, so they can offset their carbon, for example, just to make sure that they comply with the regulations. And I think you can see how this is completely not affecting at all the structure of production and the structure of profit making. So I think pricing things, to be honest, I'm not an economist. I'm not sure exactly how this could work, but it sounds like a bad idea. And it's also a bad idea because if you look at space, and space is also producing value, and the ways space is producing value have been notoriously difficult to grasp. No one knows exactly, you know, how cities, the configuration of cities, for example, add value and how these values are appropriated. The only thing that you can be certain about is that since these configurations are produced publicly and they are produced, you know, from different actors, they are eventually appropriated by, you know, some private agent, for example, and at this point, for example, that you can question if this appropriation of the collectively produced value is at the right price or not, again. But I'm not sure if, you know, pricing things can ever, give us any result. I don't know if you have thought about it at all. But to me, I think the carbon trading system was like it was at the basis of several completely irrational projects of environmental engineering around the world that have no reason to exist at all, right, or whatsoever.
Right. Maybe in the future we will do a certain lecture series around the question of, urbanism and the Anthropocene, and then we can put the topic money, and then we will discuss those relationships in greater detail. So, thank you, Nikos, and I would like to pass to Christian to respond, at least the first round.
Okay. Well, I mean, that was really a very dramatic presentation of a world that somehow is reduced into only two categories at the end. So either we have agglomerations or we have operational landscapes. I think that kind of extreme presentation of the situation is very revealing. But of course, there is also something behind that is somehow concealed by this presentation. And I think it's very important to think about also that aspect. I mean, if we go the track of monetarization, somehow we stay in that logic. Because at the end of the day, if we think, okay, we give a price to all these products, I mean, that's just a kind of neoliberal approach to give a price to everything, and we know who gives the price. I mean, these are the economists, these are, so at the end, I mean, people is completely disappearing behind these figures. And I think, so one effect of your presentation is that we understand how far, I mean, operationalization means, yes, you give a price to everything almost, but at the same time, so our kind of almost idyllic idea of agriculture or of non-urban areas is completely demolished with that presentation. And we understand that these landscapes in a large scale follow a very clear economic rationale, but also a kind of technological rationale. Now, nevertheless, there are billions of people living in these areas, in the agglomeration areas, but also in the operationalized areas. And there are also a lot of people living in areas that are neither agglomerations nor operational landscapes. We also looked at that. There are different territories that we call in Switzerland the alpine fallow lands, or landscapes that are left behind, or we could also say wastelands that are kind of have no use anymore. They are kind of exhausted, but still there are people living there. And I think it's very important to contrast this image with, let's say, the concrete everyday life of people who are confronted with these landscapes. And maybe you say a little bit, because I know, of course, you made some research and you went to the farmers in Iowa that produce this corn, and you had a look how they live. Maybe you give us a short account about what you found out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I have my... So that's an excellent point, and it allows me to explain a bit more this idea. So obviously, it should not be interpreted as a reductive new dichotomy. So we have the urban and the non-urban. No, we have the agglomeration landscapes and the operational landscapes. It's not like that. I'm saying that if we have these, let's say, two extreme things at the two ends of the spectrum, and obviously, from a methodological perspective, if you want to take a decision on what to investigate, you go to investigate the thing that is the most obvious one, right? So for me, it was just an instrumental decision to highlight only the areas that they were so obviously, part of this process, and also they had at such extremes certain conditions. For example, a very low population density, very high investment of capital, and it would be easy having this extreme then to start envisioning all these other potential configurations that are in between. But obviously, it was like a decision just to make quick progress on something. But nevertheless, I think that it makes sense, first of all, to also, I thought it was helpful to always think of it, obviously, like the global cities debate, for example, everyone criticized it, that it didn't include, for example, all the other cities that are being globalized. Also, this debate here, I selected these particular operational landscapes that are at the role of global cities, let's say, but obviously we should acknowledge that there are all these other landscapes that are becoming operationalized in much more complicated ways, and that's why I don't have them as part of my roster of case studies, because they're actually more difficult to unpack what is happening there, exactly. So it was like a conscious decision. So then, a few other things. Now, before I go to the actual production of plays and how it happens, I was thinking, if we stick to this idea of the landscape that doesn't really have too many people living there, can we envision a way of people appreciating what is happening there and pushing for alternative ways of development that are not just based on environmental conservation, questions? A good question is, for example, the Amazon, right? No one is really thinking of the Amazon as part of a development project. The people that are reacting, let's say, to the development, they are thinking it as something that should be conserved. So the save the rainforest attitude is the only attitude, basically, that exists about this landscape. So, the Tarzans in the United States, no one is actually addressing it as a mode of economic development or criticizing it as a mode of economic development. They are addressing it because of its environmental impact. So even for areas that you don't have anywhere there that could claim interests, completely uninhabited areas, like, for example, the North Pole. Can you imagine like an argument about the North Pole that is not just an environmental argument? It's not just, the Alps is amazing, or the Antarctica, the penguins. Can we envision something else that go beyond that? This is, I think, a question that links it back, nature, back to development, and not nature as just something that needs to be conserved. Now, having said that, I think it was quite fun to visit actually both of the case studies that I presented today. So I went also in Chile, in the Atacama region, and in Iowa, and I think it was revealing in. I mean, obviously, when you go there and you see the scale of these operations, this is one thing that is shocking. But the second thing is how people are actually very well informed of the situation there and very instrumental in the ways they are deciding about things. So obviously in Iowa, it was just an issue of cost and profit. I mean, you can always say that, the US farmer maybe is voting for Trump, but basically, these farmers were really unhappy with Trump because of all the problems that he was causing them to the price of soy, because of all the trade deals that he was challenging with China. So no one was really happy or ideologically so biased. It was a very instrumental approach, a very pragmatic approach to how these landscapes were configured. And even in the case of Chile, in the Atacama region, where you have all these villages with the indigenous people, that one might assume, the indigenous people are underprivileged and blah, blah, blah. And when you go there, you realize that the indigenous people are not as underprivileged as all the blue-collar workers that are being shipped there to work and have actually nothing to push for. At least these guys, they have land. They always have this argument that they can leverage. That, okay, it is our ancestor land. We have to actually push for it. We have to legally make some claims. The rest of the people that is just a floating population that is being moved around the mines are actually the real proletariat in these cases. So you start challenging this conception of, yes, in the villages, blah, blah, blah. But also, you see that maybe there is like a range social relationships that needs to be unpacked. And obviously, I think you're right. even in cases like that, exactly, that even these cases that, I mean, you can imagine that the whole population of this region in Atacama, it should be like a few 100,000 people, right? And it's like the size of, 2 times the size of Switzerland.
Yeah. I mean, this, in a way, both of you have discussed this point of differentiation or kind of unevenness of territory that we are looking at, and what should be our, perhaps, intellectual kind of frames through which we can capture that difference, no? And the Swiss book gave us a certain proposal. So indeed, it's not just in a way agglomerations and operational landscapes. There is a range of other conditions in between, and we should return to them. So, but now I have to ask Ilmar. I'm keeping that question in mind. I have a additional question, but first, Ilmar.
Yeah, also thank you for my side for this amazing presentation. I'm not sure to be pessimistic or optimistic, but maybe from my side, so I don't work at this scale, right? We're always kind of not even regional, but kind of trying to find the limits of design in terms of scale, which usually lies around, if you look at a plan, around 1 to 5,000, right? And then I would be interested in this topic because you use a lot of kind of visualization methods that are still kind of inherently relating to kind of the GIS techniques that come out of Harvard also. And we, from kind of the landscape architecture side, are very critical on the kind of planning methods that have been used, especially in the last 70 years, basically resulting in territories that are not thought of as embodied and kind of lived in, but as basically organizing space as a 2D zoning map, right? And I was wondering if you could, because you did show in your examples kind of a very interesting kind of topographic analysis, and I was wondering if you could imagine that this skill that we're talking about can be kind of activated for design, or if we are not at this moment, basically.
Yeah, I think this is always an interesting question. I think one aspect of the challenge relates to scale itself. So the more the scale that you need to comprehend moves away from your immediate experience and what you can actually describe as your immediate experience, the more you have to relate to depend on these abstractions or symbolic systems, things like that. The problem is that when these abstractions are made, they are sometimes debated. So, for example, when you're going to represent something, there is a debate maybe in the scientific community, but when it is decided and it leaves the scientific community and it goes out of it, it's considered as like a fact, right? So all these debates around it, for example, how should we map cities and what would be the threshold for a city, for example, that is behind it, you don't see it anymore. You just see a map that is showing cities according to certain methodology, right? And I think I acknowledge that this is a big challenge when working with these scales, but I think it's necessary also to be able to conceive critical GIS or critical mapping projects as something that is not necessarily reduced to the bottom-up, grassroots, local reflection of empowering all the users. I think there needs to be still some coordination, some macroscopic coordination, and it's probably like the two things working together that would help us get out of this challenge. Obviously, this presentation is heavily from the top down, right? But I would be happy to see how this kind of work could be complementing more bottom-up approaches.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. There has to be kind of a both sides, but maybe as a kind of a way out. I don't know if this. I'm just going to propose something here. Like if monetization is not the solution, right? I think we all kind of agree that this is inherently problematic. Mm-hmm.
But we are in the minority.
That's fine. Then what are the other solutions, right? And I think one is kind of the constraints. Like we are getting constrained just by the limit of the planet itself, right? And then on top of that, there's climate change and this kind of ecology, the value of it. And I think when I find solutions, I think somehow these maps should be informed by especially ecological systems and kind of the limits of space. And I don't know how to do that also. I think this is kind of problematic per se. But I don't think that we can find solutions without discussing design of a specific solution. I think, and this is why ecology is interesting, because ecology is inherently local. There's no such thing as kind of a site without a local ecology. And this is why the ecology always has to be solved locally, has to be solved spatially, and has to be solved in terms of design. And I'm always interested in pushing kind of the scales of that. How far can you go? And ideally, we would go to kind of this kind of scale. There has been kind of also ideas by Richard Weller, for instance, who has been trying to to design on a global scale. But when you look at his drawings, they're also, in a way, zoning maps. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, that's...
No, I agree completely with you. I think we are in actually not such a big problem if we are smart enough to look at the past, because what I found extremely interesting and productive is that this is actually the second time that you have an attitude like that. We had it before in the 60s, right? It was heavily criticized, and then people forgot about this criticism, and now...
You're talking about Doxiadis, for example.
Fuller, Doxiadis, these guys, for example, they would see, the Landsat program, and they would, oh, Landsat, it gives us all this information. Let's create a global simulation so we can actually plan the world. And it happened, it was criticized. Lefebvre criticized it in the 70s, for example. And now everyone is so enthusiastic about it again. But instead of also being critical about it without dismissing the technology, so I'm also not happy with these critical approaches that very easily say, oh, this is a technocratic solution, we don't want it. Actually, think about what is the problem with the technocratic solution. Is it what it tries to do? Is it the instrumentality? Is it the means? Is it the goal? What is happening exactly? We can actually be much more knowledgeable about this situation, but I don't think we are really doing it very, very well.
Great. I would love to open out to the audience. Okay, we have already one question.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. I would like to ask you, as I understood, you are thinking about, for example, the Amazons or the North Pole as a land that shouldn't just be considered preserved land, but also like a potential operational land. But what about all the lands or all the countries that are already operational lands and they are not being fully used or fully explored? Like I'm from Mexico, and I'm thinking about we have a lot of people, we have a lot of resources, natural resources to produce food, and the people is not actually willing to do it or willing to work in the agricultural land, and they are migrating to the United States to work in the agricultural land. So it's like, what kind of actions could we do to incentivize people to produce the food where they are, or to actually explore the land or the natural resources we already have and we are not taking care of or of doing?
Yes. You want to add a question? Or should I reply? Yes. No, excellent point. Actually, but I mean, what you say, I think it's much more complicated than saying people don't want to work there. It's actually exactly highlighting that the fact that agriculture is not rational, it's not a rational device for feeding people. It's just a type of profit-making operation. So what is happening, for example, in Mexico, if with NAFTA you have these agreements that allow all the US corn to flow into Mexico, it's not that people don't want to work on the land, it's not profitable enough to actually compete with US produced corn. That you saw, for example, the scale of these operations, and you can imagine how cost-efficient these models are. So I think this is exactly a point that allows us to say that if you have this globalized system of organizing resources, And you have this idea still, the 19th century idea that, oh yeah, resources, primary extraction has to do with geography. So areas that are rich in resources should be rich, for example. And you don't see that what is actually making the difference is not where the resources are, but the way they are being appropriated through the global system. So Canada, for example, had a lot of resources. It stepped upon, it exited, let's say, very well the colonial era, very well equipped, and its resource extraction sector is basically dominating the rest of the world. Australia, the same. Brazil and Mexico didn't do so well. Chile is another good example that has been struggling to nationalize, privatize, through all these phases of corruption, develop its economy in relation to mining, and now they are trying through environmental regulation, for example, to keep the Chinese out of the lithium extraction sector because they don't really want to lose this geopolitical advantage that they have. So I think it's really interesting, especially when it goes to these types of economy, because these types of economy have to do with the land. So it's not like industry that can move so easily, for example. It has to be there. And then what matters is the kind of deal, let's say, that you will make and how the value that is going to be extracted there is going to be distributed in society or not.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I greatly enjoyed it. I have a few questions. First, Melissa's introductory remark used the term urbanism, giving clearly a focus to the discipline and its potential as a design agency, which you touched upon at the very beginning, briefly, and then you talked exclusively about urbanization. So I would be interested in a discussion on the role of urbanism within urbanization processes. The second thing that would interest me and addresses the debate that you just had with Christian, the dichotomy between concentrated urbanization and operational urbanization, and you showed a diagram with a third component, which you called differential landscape. So I would be very much interested in what you understand with this. And third is, I was intrigued by the beauty of the images you used to describe operational landscapes. Okay, is this a clear agenda? But if we consider what you talked about, spatial fixes that are inherent to capitalism, the exhaustion of certain landscape, their uselessness at some moments, you would end up with wastelands as well. So was this a conscious decision on your part to show exclusively, let's say, aestheticized understandings of operational landscapes? So three questions. First one about the terminology used. The second one, the dichotomy of the two terms, concentrated and extended urbanization, with a third term that you added. And the last one is the question of the conscious move on your part to aestheticize these landscapes.
Mm-hmm. So the disciplinary question, I think it's one of the most interesting ones. I mean, the reason or not the reason, let's say the lens that I found through this investigation on planetary urbanization is the lens of the fabric, because this is what I felt more familiar with coming from a design discipline. So my background is in architecture. Having said that, I think this is also what I have been trying to say through my presentation, that if we say that the discipline of urbanism was about organizing social relations in a particular type of context, right? What if we can imagine that the shaping of this relationship extends beyond this traditional understanding of the context of the urbanism that we have, which is basically the urban fabric that I showed at the beginning. So if you say that, okay, the discipline is called urbanism, or it's called urban design, it's called something else, I mean, to me, this is not the most important thing. The important thing is you use a term, the urban design, to delineate a territory, a locus for your action. And I'm saying that there is no natural scale or locus for this action, since urbanization really doesn't have a privileged site. It's all these sites together that are part of this process. So if let's say the discipline of urbanism is trying to somehow design relationships that emerge under the urbanization process, then we should not only be looking at this particular type of landscape, the city, or the suburb, or whatever it is, right? We should be looking at the whole spectrum that is produced. And then the only thing that I found that somehow limits the scope of this, because it could be extremely wide. For example, for Buckminster Fuller, it was not about space anymore, it was about managing resources, right? To me, what is important to really keep is the spatial dimension, the physical configuration of space. So actual, relationships taking place in space, in physical contexts. So not about, so much about, extraction and circulation and flows, but about, the physical configuration of things. At some point, you have to put something somewhere. You have to build something here and not there, right? You have to put some infrastructure in one place and not in another place. So this is my take on that. Now the second question, perhaps it's more for Christian. I can tell you my interpretation of it. Yeah.
Shall we pass the microphone to Christian?
No, maybe you answer to the third question.
Yes, sorry, yes, exactly. So the third question about the sensitization, I mean, I wouldn't really call it, aesthetic question. I would probably call it a representation or communication question. What I found quite productive with in my collaboration with Neil and also with Christian was that at some point I was reading all these, critical geographers or, urban sociologists, and they had a very elegant ways of describing spatial relationships, but it was like they were afraid to actually somehow try to spatialize them in a drawing, because it would deconstruct the complexity of these relationships. So the moment you actually put it on a map and on a drawing, it actually loses all this complexity that these concepts have with them and all this richness that it has with them. So all this project is somehow a project to add the communication of these spatialized relationships into the critical geography debates in a way that, obviously it's like just starting of the project, let's say, in a way that would be critically and reflexively using all the capacities of the tools that we have right now, without just dismissing them as, technocratic tools or just as aesthetic tools of representation that are reducing concepts to, an actual, image or a map. So obviously, things are being reduced, but I think there is a value in complementing the debate with this kind of work. Obviously, only through this kind of work, you're not going anywhere, but with the intellectual capacity of people like Christian, for example, or Neil, and this complementary effort, I think there is something to be, a story to be told and something to be added to the debate.
Okay, so I try now to step into that debate. And somehow I would like to make a link between all your questions. And I start with the third one, with the aesthetic effect. I mean, you could say this is the photograph that makes it. But it is also the result of design. So all these landscapes, they are designed. It is not, I mean, that's not something that, this is not just fallen from sky or something. Somebody designed it. And the designers were not architects in most of the cases. The designers were engineers. And different kinds of engineers, but they designed it to the most, let's say, efficient grids. Now, that would be my starting point. if we think about how to combine that kind of urbanization, and so this urbanization is, in that case, operational landscapes are designed. And we could somehow use also design to design it in a different way. And I mean, these were some experiments we did at ETH Studio Basel. And to give just one example, we could then go on further, but to give just one example, it was actually a free diploma. The question was, could a motorway be more than just a motorway? Could that be something that is, could it become a parkway? Could it become something that is somehow pleasant, that is not just a kind of a device that is organized in the most, let's say, rational sense? I think that would be a starting point. If we discuss about the tramway, then it would become even more clear what it could be. But so here is, so we would bring into different kind of rationales, not just the optimization of the economic gain, not just the full rationalization. I think that would be the first thing, to think about, could it be designed in a different way, because it is designed. And then the second point is, and that's the other side of urbanization, is of course what Neil Brenner and I called differential urbanization, is that the urbanization process as such always produces somehow unexpected effects. And it is not just, it is, I mean, if it's fully controlled by technocrats, then it has almost no chance to produce any effects. But fortunately, it is not always fully controlled. So we could see a lot of other situations where all sorts of different rationales somehow clash, somehow different logics, different ideas somehow come together or clash together and produce unexpected moments. And not the least, of course, and then we have always to bring people back into the picture. This was my point. Because if that is completely evacuated of people, then we are lost. But if you have people that are coming back, so the workers, the people that live there, the migrants, the tourists, whatever, that enters the picture, then we have a chance that out of this kind of seemingly clean and clear models, suddenly something new emerges. And I mean, again, this was a kind of conviction we found at ETH Studio Basel when we said, when we discussed about the question of specificity. So you have these generic and these general models, and the idea is that these models are always kind of laid out and realized in the ideal way. And we came to the conclusion that this is not true. It is not true. It is sometimes, and the photographs somehow can be misleading in that sense, that we think it is fully controlled, but it's not. And that's the chance. That's precisely our chance. And there we have to, this is our hope, but it could also be a strategy.
How are we doing? Perhaps one or two more questions, Ilmar? Okay, one question from the audience, and maybe I will reserve one.
Yeah, I also found your talk very interesting and inspiring. I did my doctoral research on Johannesburg, and I was often confronted with these sort of questions as to how, even for me, what was quite large on a regional scale would connect to the even bigger picture on the planetary scale. So I particularly appreciated your maps at the beginning, where you were juxtaposing sort of the built-up area with what you called this biomass harvesting. So I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about how that map was made with the biomass. Was that comprised out of these four categories you mentioned, for example, the agricultural land? And tied to that a bit, to keep people in the picture, as Christian was just mentioning, is there any way that those maps could be combined to provide more specificity? So is there a way to track a bit what the hinterlands are that are related? I'm wondering about that too, because I feel like a lot of times this rural and urban dichotomy is problematized today as a social problem and weaponized for political purposes, for example, in Trump country. So I was wondering, just overall, if you could tell me more about how the map was made and your general methodologies, what you discovered during that process.
Yeah, maybe that also links back to the previous question on the construction of data. So as a disclaimer, I showed several maps, and behind most of them, there is obviously some methodology for producing it that I am just taking for granted. For this particular map, the methodology is called the human appropriation of net primary productivity. So these maps are basically dealing with that. What the net primary productivity is basically all the energy that is coming from the sun and absorbed into the plants through photosynthesis. So this is, let's say, the first step of grasping energy and putting it into the Earth system, right? So this is the net primary productivity. So there are also maps that show the capacity of nature to produce this, biomass. These maps that I showed was actually the human appropriation of this primary productivity. So this is the part of vegetation or forestry that is actually harvested. So not, for example, the rainforest in the Amazon, for example, that no one is touching, but agricultural areas in the Midwest. I mean, when I was doing these maps, I studied a bit this example, and it was quite interesting because there is another series of maps that compares the natural, let's say, capacity of vegetation to produce biomass with the humanly induced capacity, and you can actually see which areas are producing more than they should, and which areas are producing and no one is appropriating it. So you have areas, for example, like this one, that if there was no human intervention, they would not produce so much, like in Iowa, I mean. And there are other areas that are obviously producing and no one is appropriating it. This is just a side note. I mean, I wish we could have a more detailed discussion on the data sets used, but I mean, it's just a matter of time, I guess. And I sorry, what was the second question about the particular relations between the different areas, right?
Yeah. Also, because I was wondering about your methods, did you do a lot of interviewing when you were there in Ohio, or how did those two sort of scales inform each other in your work?
In Iowa, you mean?
Yes, sorry.
Yeah. I mean, I was lucky enough to have an easy way through actually one of the students that were here, and his whole family were farmers, so he was like one of the persons that helped me establish some connections. So yes, we had some discussions there. But this is not the work that I am used to doing, qualitative research. So I invested more in my presentation in what I do best. And I acknowledge that obviously it's not a complete version. But I think I understood your question in a different way. You were wondering what is the relation between the areas that are producing and the areas that are consuming, like the metabolism or not?
Yeah, a bit. If that sort of is something that relates to the social problem between this perceived rural and urban dichotomy today.
Okay. Yeah, because I mean the whole idea behind doing this more landscape focused investigation is that I was observing the different metabolism studies, so studies on urban metabolism, which is like a useful way to start understanding, let's say, the way cities relate to the broader landscapes. But I found them too focused on measuring flows of things and not actually investigating the landscapes that they are producing them. So I felt there was like a missing element in actually investigating the landscapes. And then, in the second step, when I started investigating the landscapes, I realized that also everyone was kind of obsessed with reconstructing the change of things, like the location. Oh, let's find exactly the location where this came from, and recreate the chain, the logistics chain. And I thought that these were both extremely difficult to do because these logistic chains are very obscure, but also maybe it was not so important because they are also very flexible. So even if you mapped it 1 year, maybe the next year it would be reconfigured. For example, in the case that I mentioned with the guy that was angry with Trump, they were selling soy to China. At some point, Trump decides to cut the deal that they had, and then they import the soy from Brazil, actually. So the commodity chain is reconfigured immediately, which means that maybe it's more important, instead of identifying the locations of things, to identify the types of landscapes that are involved. So even if they would import soy from Brazil, maybe actually the area in Brazil that produced soy could be interesting to compare it with the area in the Midwest that produces the soy. And maybe then the port that they would use to export it would be interesting to compare it with the other port. So it's not necessarily where is it going exactly, but that you have an assembly of different landscapes that come together in certain ways. And these ways are similar. I mean, the landscapes are obviously different, but they're similar types of configurations, right?
So, a brief question. You are also an educator, you teach, and you teach at Royal College of Art, and you teach at University of Luxembourg, where you have an advanced master program in architecture and European urbanization and globalization. And I want to link it now back to urbanism and to design in the end. So as somebody who teaches, what, and necessarily you teach in the architecture programs, and your destination is research design, or let's say the notion of design is central to the courses that you create. So the question is, what are the emerging agendas in those courses? Where are you heading with those projects? Mm-hmm. What are the design agendas, let's say? At which scales are they formulated? What do they pertain to?
Mm-hmm. I think there are two different approaches for the two different programs. I think that the overarching question that I also had when I started doing these two studios was whether you can have a studio without a proposal, a project, like something that you actually want to transform and change, and whether you could just have an analytical investigation. And I just started doing that last year, but I have to say I didn't find it very successful, and not having a project actually. And I don't know whether it was because, for example, the students were not convinced that you can actually have a studio without a project, or because there is no point in trying to do something like that. In the RCA, we wanted to have a project. So in the first term, it was pure analysis. In the second, they had to actually define the program, the brief. In the third term, it was developing the project. And I actually found it quite interesting how much more progress they did in the one semester that they had to do the project than in the other two that they were only doing the analysis. So, I mean, again, I'm not sure if it's because of the students and their background, for example, because also they were in graduate programs, so they already had this architectural education. Oh, you do the analysis in order to do something, right? You don't do the analysis for analysis' sake. There is no point in doing that. I mean, why would you do that? So I'm not sure. I'm not convinced for anything. I just want to try out different things and see what happens.
Great. We could almost start another debate right here, but for today we are finished. So please help me in thanking Ilmar and Christian and Nikos for this great session, which was already too long, but on the other hand, way too short. So I look forward to continue. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Christian.